Thank the various organizations who've come together to help make this happen. Briefly, I got into looking at this issue because of the exponential growth in the prison population that's been taking place over the past 40 years. In 1972, there were about 270,000 people in prison and jail in the U.S. And that number had been relatively consistent from the 1920s when the U.S. first started keeping records on the number of people in jail and prison. It had been consistent within the 200,000 range. But from that period in 1972 until right now, there's been an exponential increase in the number of people in prison. And now there are 2.3 million people in prison. And if you include the number of people in jails as well, we've topped the 3 million mark. So more than one for every 100 citizens that there are. Every year, there will be 10 million people that go in and out of jail, or prison or state jail, people who have less than 1 year sentences. So at any given time, there's 3 million people incarcerated, but over a year's time, 10 million people go in and out of that system. And I was really compelled to look into this, not only because of the exponential growth, but also the transformation in who we've been putting in prison. At that time, before the exponential growth started, about 75% of the people who were incarcerated were white, and that was consistent with the percentages of people in the country. Now, 75% of the people incarcerated are Black and Latino. And so this shift that we had, this huge shift, both in the number of people who are incarcerated and then the demographic shift in the people who are incarcerated, that really let me know that there was something going on that we really needed to look at. And what I found overwhelmingly was the issue behind the increase in incarceration rates has been the ramped up war on drugs that really started under Nixon, but got even more gasoline onto the fire under the Reagan-Bush administrations during the 80s and early 90s, and has essentially continued. So I want to talk some about that history. When we look back at the history, the criminalization of drug use has consistently been used as a tool to gain political power, and most often gain political power by galvanizing fear about minority populations. So the very first drug laws that were passed in this country actually were in the 1870s in California, 1875 in San Francisco to be exact. And those laws were passed against smoking opium in dens. Can you guys guess why they would pass laws against smoking opium in dens in California in the 1870s? It was about the Chinese immigrants. So it's from the very inception of anti-drug laws, it's been about fears, about immigrant populations, about demonized populations, about dehumanized populations. And there was a discourse that went along with those laws that were passed in the 1870s in California about how dirty Chinese were, about how criminal they were, about the sinfulness that took place in opium dens, about people being raped, and about this country being invaded and taken over by a quote-unquote Eastern Chinese menace. And you not only had that discourse within legal circles, you had that discourse within the media, you had that discourse within the national magazine publications, accompanied by cartoons depicting Chinese as really invading America and really being a menace kind of plague upon our population. And those were the first anti-drug laws in the 1870s. We first got national drug prohibition started in 1914 with the Harrison Act. and we'll be coming upon the century anniversary of that in 2 years. And when we look at what was the impetus behind the Harrison Act in 1914, the kind of language that was used, the kind of stories that were being told, was about black folks in the South no longer working on plantations, but mixing cocaine with wine to come up with a maddening compound that made them go on murderous rages, that made them start raping white women, et cetera, et cetera. They claimed that this was being used by blacks in terms of their working conditions in the fields, if they were still doing sharecropping. But this was a discourse that started in the South. As it moved north, you had a different kind of discourse about the sins of urban life, about people coming in, immigrants still, as well as blacks coming up in the South, that were using drugs as a way to ripen women for a sinful life and for prostitution. And this discourse, it was in the New York Times, it was in a number of different newspapers, spread over and over again, and those kinds of debates were taking place in Congress, and that provided the fuel behind the first national prohibition on narcotic use. And that's when we started criminalizing not just the people who were using, but also doctors who were trying to treat people for addiction. But at that time, what we now call Schedule I narcotics, the only two that were on there were your derivative of opiates, so your like heroin, et cetera, and cocaine. The story of how marijuana gets added to that list has a local component. That began in the 1930s and it began here in Texas. And it's, maybe you can imagine who that language was directed for here in Texas in the 1930s by some of your very right-wing religious organizations, Christian organizations, talking about the sins of Mexican immigrants and their use of the marijuana plant. Not only for indulging in a certain kind of lifestyle, but also, once again, the theme of using drugs to make women sexually promiscuous is consistent throughout this history. So that discourse starts in Texas in the 1930s, and it spreads when we look at the discourse about marijuana in the North. You had the federal government claiming that jazz musicians were using marijuana to also make white women promiscuous. That being constant, over and over again. And it was soon after that that marijuana got added to one of the drugs that were under national prohibition. And throughout this time, from the early 19-teens into the 1950s, you had a growing federal agency who gained a lot of power in enforcing these drug laws. That was the Federal Bureau of Narcotics. They published a magazine where they talk about a lot of these different stories that you get around the prohibition of drugs. And in the 50s, they went so far as to make a number of outrageous claims. The 50s is when we get the birth of the gateway drug narrative about marijuana. And it was started by the director of the Federal Bureau of Narcotics in testimony before Congress. And what he said at that point was that marijuana makes people very violent, makes them go on violent binges, makes them insane, makes them promiscuous, that sometimes it's been known for people to go on even murderous binges or criminal binges smoking marijuana. And I know this isn't a crowd where anybody who's smoked marijuana before, but if you know anybody who's smoked marijuana before, you will know that that's a bunch of hogwash, that the drug doesn't do anything like that. And in this particular instance, he got called on it. His name is Harry Anslinger, who was the director of the Federal Bureau of Narcotics for over 30 years. He got called on it. The doctor called him on it and said, actually, that's a bunch of BS. Marijuana doesn't do any of that stuff. And, you know, he said, all right, you got me, you're right. It doesn't do that stuff, but it's the first step for heroin, more potent drugs, where all those things do happen. And from that moment on, this is in 1951, from that moment on, you know, we had this gateway theory about the use of marijuana, and it has persisted. One of the other things that has consistently been in the National Drug Prohibition sort of discourse has been this idea about national takeover. You know, so not only in terms of the immigrant situation, but in the 50s, they started saying that the Chinese and the communists were importing drugs into the U.S. to make the U.S. right for communist takeover. Of course, that was during the Red Scare period, where you had all this discourse about communism going on, right? So it was a claim that the communists were using and selling drugs, and this is from the Southeast Asia region, trying to bring your different opiates in the U.S. to make the U.S. right for communist takeover. More recently, we've seen the story perpetrated that buying illegal drugs helps support terrorism, right? And, you know, so that has been a consistent theme over and over again, this idea that somehow the drug trade is what's going to make America be taken over by these outside alien forces that are going to come in and destroy our lives. It's very important that we just keep sight of how that discourse has changed subtly from period to period based on who our ideas of the boogeyman are, right? So an interesting thing happened during the 60s where you had a lot of middle class children experiencing with or experimenting with drug use. And you had a change in the national attitude because you could not depict all of those children as our favorite boogeyman to be put in jail. And so you had a shift in the narrative that takes place in the late 1960s into the early 70s about treating substance abuse more as a mental health issue and more as taking a health approach, a medicalized approach, rather than a criminal justice approach. But when Nixon comes into office, he really reverses that. And because Nixon saw drug use as related to the countercultural movements, and for him, he didn't like the young people, the hippies, who didn't like him. He also saw it as a way to galvanize support against inner cities, to use it as part of the national war on crime. And the wonderful thing about Nixon, you go back and you listen to those Oval Office tapes. And this is a funny side story. So Nixon implemented the Oval Office taping system because he did not want any revisionist historians going back and rewriting his opinions and his ideas about what he was doing. So we have this wonderful trove of all the thoughts that he had about all these different issues. And since then, you know, it's one of those things that makes every president just kind of cringe, right? And, you know, so there will never be anything like that ever again. But Nixon was very clear in talking to his staff and saying, we need an issue that will galvanize the country, we need an enemy, and we need something that we can use as a tool against our political foes. And he saw the war on drugs as perfect for that. That it could be used as a tool against people in the countercultural movement. It could be used as a tool within the inner cities and for fighting a war on crime that had actually started earlier during the Kennedy administration as a war on organized crime. But this was a way during the Johnson administration, it got turned into a war on street crime. And Nixon turned that into a war on drugs and said, let's focus our war on street crime to a war on drugs. So it's a way of turning the national attitude away from these big organized crime syndicates and saying, let's go after these terrible people in the inner cities who are doing all this protesting. Not too subtle, right? The interesting thing that happens during this time, though, is Nixon gets kind of foiled by the fact that there's all these Vietnam vets that are coming back from the war who have serious heroin habits. And with those serious heroin habits, there is a national sort of trend to really want to give them treatment, as there should have. And you have the start of methadone that got discovered in the 1960s that really gets shown to be efficacious in helping people resume normal lives who have very bad opiate habits. And so the war on drugs that he envisioned, he couldn't fully implement. And the original funding of some $120 million that they appropriated in 1972 for the war on drugs, most of it actually went to treatment in the methadone clinics, which, you know, it's weird to have to give Nixon a compliment, but I find myself having to, you know, at least compliment something about the Nixon administration. This all changes drastically during the Reagan administration as they pick up on the fact that the war on drugs can be used as a tool in the culture wars. So, interestingly enough, the first 4 years of Reagan's presidency, the strategy was to really go after drugs at their source, you know, and not try to overly criminalize Americans, but try to practice interdiction policies. And that was disastrous for the countries in whom that we said the drugs were coming from, because we had a very militaristic approach, and we mandated that these countries allow us to bring this militarized approach to fighting the war on drugs into their territories in order for them to be able to have any kind of trade agreements with the U.S., in order for them to be accepted in international organizations, et cetera, right? So we had this kind of carrot and stick approach with the countries throughout Latin America to say that you have to let us come into your home territory with a militarized anti-drug war or drug war approach in order to be welcomed into the community of modern states, kind of thing, in order to be able to participate in our global economic markets. And a lot of those countries signed on or felt that they really had no choice. And so for those first 4 years of the Reagan presidency, we start getting this militarized intervention in these Latin American countries. It was during the second half of his presidency that things turned to where that militarized approach started being brought with or in-house at the same time as outside the country. And a number of things happened that enabled that. For one, you had some neocons working within the Reagan administration who happened to also be doctors and wrote a few very influential position papers to say, look, in these past 4 years with this kind of very intense public awareness campaign about substance abuse, we've managed to dramatically decrease the number of middle-class white kids who are using. And what we see now is continuing to be a lot more concentrated use in poverty areas. But he didn't ascribe that use to being a product of poverty. Instead, it got talked about as these being hardened users for whom a public health approach would not work. And that we needed a kind of new focus on the user campaign, which was exactly the words that they used. Focus on the User campaign, a tough love campaign. And I don't know if you all remember at the time, you had these programs like Scared Straight, et cetera, that really worked on trying to terrorize children away from using drugs. So this influential policy person, thing happened to be Donald Ian McDonald. He was from Clearwater, Florida, and he had a son who he caught with marijuana and sent him to one of these programs. And it scared the crap out of his child. And his child supposedly stopped using marijuana. And he brought that kind of personal perspective to writing these position papers and said, let's have this same kind of very tough criminalized approach for these hardened users. And so we had a shift in national drug policy to really bring this militarized approach to the U.S. But it was not only that. The Republicans had identified for the 1988 election that in all areas except one, they were polling directly even with Democrats. And the one area where they were polling about 20% above Democrats was in the war on drugs. So in the memos that got passed around, they said we need to make the war on drugs the central issue that we face as a nation. And in doing so, we will help elect George Bush to succeed Reagan as president. And that strategy, along with a couple of key laws that got passed leading up to that election period, both in 1986 and the 1988 Omnibus Drug Acts, really did significant jobs transforming the way that the war on drugs was waged. So one of the first and most influential ways was that it was a revision of the organized crime RICO laws that were passed in the 1960s. And this revision of the laws enabled local law enforcement agencies to confiscate the personal property of people who were caught with drugs. And this means if you're driving in your car and you have marijuana in your possession, the police can take your car and sell it at auction. They can do this to your house. They can do this to your boat. If you have cash on you, they can take that cash and keep it. The other thing about that is that those monies used to have to be sent to the federal government, and they no longer have to be sent to the federal government. So it created a profit incentive for local law enforcement agencies to fight the drug war in this particular manner. And right now, property confiscation is a $500 billion a year industry for local law enforcement agencies in the U.S. They make $500 billion per year taking people's property and selling it at auction. Making so much money did not escape your local legislatures, and they began to take away some of the public funding for police departments because they had so much drug money. And so now, police departments aren't just doing this to make a profit, but they're sometimes, in some localities, their actual salaries are dependent on them continuing to fight the drug war in this kind of way, right? And it also enabled them to buy all kinds of new equipment, particularly all kinds of new surveillance and military-style equipment, infrared scopes that they can look into people's houses, helicopters, they can detect growing lights within people's properties. And this was huge. Not only that, you had prison guard unions begin to get in on the action too, as they began to link their job security to the increased prison population. Prison guard unions became very powerful in the 1980s, and now they're some of the most powerful unions that there are. And they have been the ones sort of spearheading a lot of our mandatory minimum sentencing laws that got passed over the past 20 years. Primarily, 3 strikes was one of the main ones. And this started in California with the California Correctional Peace Officers Association. They got together a group of family members from people who have been victims of violent crime and started supporting them to come together as to be the face of a coalition for increased mandatory minimum sentencing. And that was very effective as a tool to have crime victims' families become the face of this movement for passing much tougher laws that would take away any discretion from both prosecutors and judges in terms of conviction for substance abuse issues. And this has had a devastating effect on our prison populations, on local families. And you can see the different ways that it too has created additional profit motives for the war on drugs. Not only that, the privatization movement of prisons that also started within this period. You have a number of different private companies that now own prisons, and their motivation, not only because it's a secure government contract for the number of people you house, but there's also a number of prisons who run them, or a number of private prisons who are run as manufacturing centers. So people in prison are not under the same laws for minimum wage that you and I are. And prison labor is paid anywhere from between 15 and 35 cents an hour. So you had a lot of private companies understanding that if they could move a manufacturing base here to the U.S. and not have to ship it overseas, that if you could use prison labor, it would be just as cheap as shipping it overseas. And you could not have to pay the additional price of having those products shipped back over to the U.S. So you have the private prison companies, you have prison guard unions, local law enforcement, as well as the prison building industry, just companies that specialize in building prisons. It was one of the fastest growing industries throughout the 1990s. And then you think of all the ancillary services that go along with running a prison. One phone booth in a prison makes $20,000 a year. So you multiply that by about 20, 30 phone booths per prison that you have within each prison, and you multiply that by the number of prisons nationwide, and you can begin to get a sense of the gravy train that the war on drugs has become. The other thing, and I know we're kind of running out of time, I just want to make sure that I give you as much information as possible. Local communities who had factories close and had a decimation in their labor base have started welcoming prisons, not only because of the jobs that they provide, but also a county that has a prison in it can count the number of people in prison as part of their residents who live below the poverty level. And in doing so, it opens them up for additional federal funding for you name it. So there's that incentive at the county level to say that we can use our prisoner base to enable us to pull more federal funding, not to serve the prisoners, but to serve any other needs that we may have. And so you see on down the line the number of different entities that are set up to capitalize off incarceration. And I work for one of them at UTMB. We have the big TBCJ hospital there. UTMB started that contract in the 80s because the prison system pays a lot better than people who didn't have insurance. And at the time, UTMB was at least still pretending to be an institution that treated people who did not have third-party coverage. And we've abandoned that model now. But it's a significant contract for the university, millions of dollars a year. So you think of the medical services, the cleaning services, laundry services, all of it, the food services, all these services have to be contracted out. And so when a prison comes to town, it's big business for almost everyone. but the cost being all the lives that are being destroyed because of it.